When I say the word compliance, what does that mean? It's a pretty broad term. It can mean compliance to financial obligations, quality and safety, or general compliance to any regulation that is driving the organization. As our next guest, Tim Lozier, points out in his article, Benchmarking Risk and Compliance, how do you add up? I'm sorry, benchmarking risk compliance, how do you add up? That's the name of the article. As Tim says in his article, when you look at the current state of quality management and safety management with respect to compliance, most of the challenges arise in the overall operations and processes that govern companies' adherence to common standards and initiatives. So with that in mind, Lozier's company surveyed companies to answer simple questions about their overall compliance processes and activities related to quality management or safety management. Based on these results, they were presented with a score that identified the basic grade of the health of their compliance activities. Here to talk about that survey and some of its implications is Tim Lozier, Director of Product Strategy for Verse Solutions. Morning, Tim.
Morning, guys. How are you?
Pretty good. Well, tell us a little bit first about the survey you conducted. What were you trying to learn specifically, and who actually was surveyed?
Sure. So when we actually started this whole process, we really were looking more or less for a free tool that our audience could actually just grade their compliance. And so the goal was simple. It was just to ask a few easy questions about typical compliance and operational activities that they do within their business, and ultimately score and see how they can potentially improve. So what we found was that we collected a lot of data on these events, and we were able to look at this and say there were certain aspects that really met well with respect to compliance, but there were also areas where they weren't excelling as best as they could. And so one of the things that came out of this was the difference, or the combination of operational excellence and compliance. So like I said in the article and in the webinar that we're going to have next week, compliance is really about doing what's required of you. It's adherence to some sort of standard, some sort of regulatory initiative, whereas operational excellence is really doing what's desired, the end state at which your company wants to be at to continuously improve and foster collaboration. And so while we found that a lot of companies did really well at adhering to compliance in terms of document management and training and regular auditing, when you start to look down and drill into some of the more operational excellence concepts, they were incurring a lot of risk in terms of actually achieving some of those goals. Process management was a big risk for them, as well as was timeliness of corrective action. So there's a combination that companies really need to look at as of what's required in compliance versus what's desired in operational excellence.
Well, let me jump in a little bit here. I mean, you mentioned something that's kind of interesting. You mentioned timeliness of corrective actions. Why is that? Why is timeliness in corrective action so hard to achieve? I mean, that's kind of, corrective action is kind of one of the cornerstones, I think, of a quality management system.
Yeah, and we were surprised by that as well. So we figured that a lot of companies would be doing corrective actions as it is required, as among other things. But what happens is that we found that the idea of a corrective action had a very strong compliance notion to it. So a lot of companies would start that process of doing a corrective action, and then when there's the need to initiate action plans, rely on other stakeholders, escalate when needed, delegate when needed, they found that they were having some frustrations around that. And I think it goes down to the whole idea of understanding what a corrective action really should be. A lot of times corrective action, maybe not necessarily generally in the quality area, but with other areas within the business, see it almost as I have to do this kind of stigma. Whereas really, if we start shifting our mindset to saying, well, corrective action really is something that we can achieve continuous improvement on, and we can really benefit from the results of a corrective action, both from an operational excellence standpoint and from just shifting your mindset to really that continuous improvement. And that's something that I think, when we look at the new ISO 9001 2015 standard, there is that mind shift, the mind shift that goes into more of a risk-based thinking kind of mentality to continuously improve and drive leadership.
Well, let me jump in there, Tim, because I'm glad you mentioned that. What exactly did you learn from the survey about how companies are dealing with risk? And as you mentioned, ISO 9001 2015 certainly addresses risk-based thinking.
Well, yeah. So obviously, with the new standard coming out, there's this whole concept of risk-based thinking, which is kind of what exactly is risk-based thinking. I think a lot of companies are trying to struggle and wrap their head around, the generalities of that concept. So what we ended up doing, we ended up creating another tool. Really, we created this risk tracker tool, which is really just a simple risk form that allowed people to quantify different events that happen within their organization, calculate the risk, and maybe look at what the actions are. And so it's something we're going to talk about next week as well. But what we found was that the concepts that were really strong in compliance around managing your processes and doing audits and executing on corrective actions were also the areas where risk was the highest. So one of the highest risks we saw was around activities around process management. So it's interesting to see that companies have looked at the concept of compliance, but the risks that are associated with them are still inherently high. And so one of the things that we are striving to educate on and to provide guidance on is, how do you start that risk journey? How do you really start thinking about risk in your daily operations? And really, that kind of thought process is going to allow companies to shift their mindset from compliance or what's required to true operational excellence, and ultimately known as what's desired. And that's the whole goal, and it's really interesting stuff that we've found.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And we're going to be talking about this a lot more next week. As Tim mentioned there, we have a webinar coming up next Thursday, November 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, benchmarking risk in compliance with your peers. How do you measure up? So Tim Lozier of Verse Solutions, thanks for joining us this morning, and we'll see you next Thursday at the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It's been fun.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, and all of you out there, be sure to keep an eye on your email, because we'll be sending you some email invitations to come out and join that webinar. Okay.